The Ainsworth Equine Trust had always seemed timeless, nestled among rolling fields and thick hedgerows just beyond the village of Willowcroft. Horses grazed behind post and rail fences. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of wet earth and hay. For most who arrived, the trust was a place of gentle routines and second chances. But that morning, something was different. The rattling of a horse trailer shattered the quiet. Staff gathered in the yard, their faces taut with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Only Lady Beatrice Ainsworth stood apart, her posture ramrod straight, eyes shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat as the trailer reversed with a hiss and a clatter. She had inherited the trust from her father, along with all its burdens. With every passing season, it seemed the legacy grew heavier. The driver's hands shook as he unlatched the ramp. He glanced over his shoulder, voice low. Careful. He's not like the others. Out of the dark interior came Kestrel, a towering gray gelding, his muscles tense beneath a coat marred by old scars. His eyes, wild, white-rimmed, darted across the yard, nostrils flaring at every unfamiliar sound. Each hoofstep was both hesitant and explosive, a bundle of nervous energy wound too tight. No one spoke. The only sound was the muffled thud of Kestrel's hooves on the ramp. Mr. Davies, the stable manager, stepped forward, jaw clenched. He took the lead rope but gave the horse a wide berth, keeping his movements slow, measured. Kestrel snorted and threw up his head, threatening to bolt. Someone whispered, "Is that the cavalry horse from the news?" Lady Beatrice gave a tiny nod. Yes, Royal Cavalry, decorated, until the accident. Rumors had swirled for weeks. A parade gone wrong, gunfire, chaos. Kestrel had been a hero, but something inside him had broken that day. The military's official word was irreparable trauma. Now, at the trust, he was simply another case file, but one with a reputation so severe that even the seasoned handlers eyed him warily. A veterinary report was clipped to the gate, stark and uncompromising, severe PTSD. Prone to unpredictable violent outbursts, danger to self and others. Kestrel's fate was all but sealed. The trust was barely solvent. And dangerous horses, however noble their pasts, were a luxury Lady Beatrice could hardly afford. "Should have been put down," muttered one of the grooms, not quietly enough. Lady Beatrice shot her a look. The trust prided itself on giving lost causes a chance, but even she knew sentiment alone couldn't pay bills. As the others debated logistics, a slight figure watched from behind the feed-room door. Elspeth had been at the trust for just 6 months, a volunteer who rarely spoke, but who worked with a quiet, methodical intensity that impressed the staff. She lingered at the edges, moving through chores with a kind of invisible efficiency. Unlike the others, Elspeth was not afraid. She understood fear too well, the way it could make the world shrink to a pinpoint, the way even kindness could become overwhelming noise. When she saw Kestrel's trembling flank and the way his gaze darted for an escape, something inside her shifted. Kestrel was led, or rather half-dragged, to a quarantine stall. The doors were double-latched. Notices were posted, "Do not approach alone." Kestrel spun, eyes wild, slamming his hindquarters into the wood until the whole building seemed to shake. Mr. Davies muttered a curse, barely keeping hold of the rope. Lady Beatrice walked the perimeter of the stall, her heels clicking on the concrete. She paused beside Davies. "We can't afford another accident." Davies nodded, sweat beading on his brow. "He's not safe, milady." "Military couldn't handle him. What makes you think we can?" Beatrice's reply was almost inaudible. "Because if we don't try, who will?" That night, rain battered the slate roof. The stables were a chorus of restless hooves and distant thunder. Elspeth sat on her cot, the glow of her phone illuminating notes about equine trauma, case studies, rescue forums. Every so often, she glanced at the old photograph taped to the wall. A little girl in a hospital bed, clutching a battered stuffed horse. She touched the image gently, then wrote something new in her journal. Kestrel. Fear is not aggression. Remember. The next morning, Elspeth arrived before dawn. The others avoided Kestrel's stall, preferring chores with the easier horses. Elspeth lingered nearby, pretending to sweep the aisle, but she was really watching, cataloging every flinch, every breath. Lady Beatrice found her there. "You don't have to be here, Elspeth." Elspeth shrugged, her eyes fixed on Kestrel. "He looks lonely." Lady Beatrice softened just for a moment. "He's dangerous. Please be careful." For the first time, Elspeth looked up and met her gaze. "Sometimes, lonely is more dangerous." Lady Beatrice started to say something, but then she just nodded and moved on. That afternoon, a council meeting was held in the office above the tack room. The agenda was grim. Kestrel's mounting costs, declining donations, the very real threat of closure. Mr. Davies laid out the numbers with military precision. "He's not suitable for rehoming, and the insurance won't cover another incident. We have to be realistic." Beatrice turned to the window, watching the rain. "My father started this trust to save lives, not to give up when it gets hard." Davies's voice was strained. "Sometimes mercy is letting go." Outside, the sky cleared. A shaft of sunlight pierced the clouds, falling directly on Kestrel's stall. Elspeth, unnoticed by the council, crept close to the barred window, just far enough to be seen, but not to threaten. Kestrel watched her with wary eyes. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just stood there, breathing quietly, offering her presence. Minutes passed. At last, Kestrel's ears flicked forward, a small, almost invisible sign of curiosity. Elspeth smiled, a slow, patient smile. "Hi, Kestrel." Kestrel tossed his head but did not retreat. Behind her, footsteps echoed. Davies's voice was gruff. "Stay away from that one. He'll hurt you." Elspeth didn't answer. She simply kept standing there, breathing in time with the frightened horse, as if her silent promise could reach across the gulf between them. In the office, the council's voices rose. "We can't keep every lost cause. If we lose another donor..." The vet says, "Enough." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the noise. "I will not let my father's legacy end in fear." Below, as the sun set and the world quieted, Elspeth and Kestrel stood facing each other, two exiles searching for trust in a world that misunderstood them both. For the first time since his arrival, Kestrel's shaking stopped. A legacy might be forgotten, but sometimes all it took was one silent promise to bring it back to life. The next morning broke cold and gray, with a shroud of mist curling along the paddocks and dampening the old stone walls of the trust. Inside the stable block, the routines began. Buckets clanging, soft nickers, the steady rhythm of brooms against concrete. But around Kestrel's stall, there was an undercurrent of unease. He stood at the farthest corner, chest heaving, eyes haunted. Mr. Davies, the longtime stable manager, moved through the barn with a practiced authority. He was a man of rigid habits. Every halter hung just so, every feed measured to the ounce. The lines on his face spoke of years of hard labor and harder lessons. Horses, in his mind, responded to structure. Order meant safety. Safety was non-negotiable. He stopped outside Kestrel's stall, shoulders squared. Davies had known dangerous horses before, but there was something in Kestrel, a wildness that rankled, a refusal to yield. Davies frowned as he watched the gelding toss his head and stamp, teeth bared at the smallest sound. Davies spoke to his assistant in a low tone. "He's not learning. That horse is defiant, thinks he's still in the cavalry. You want safety? You need to show him who's in charge." The assistant, younger and less sure, nodded. But Elspeth, she's been sitting near his stall, just watching. Davies's mouth tightened. That girl has no business near him. Dreamers don't last long in this work. Horses need rules, not daydreams. He strode away, but his words lingered, coloring the mood in the barn. People gave Kestrel a wide berth, whispering warnings about his unpredictable temper. In the feed room, Elspeth sat at the edge of the commotion, reading quietly, her small figure almost blending with the shadows. She heard the talk but did not respond. Words had never been her armor. Elspeth felt more at ease among animals than people. Words crowded her head, tangling her thoughts. But with horses, it was different. She sensed moods, energy, the subtle shifts of breath and posture. Horses never lied or demanded explanations. After chores, when the others gathered for tea, Elspeth slipped away to the end of the barn. She settled herself outside Kestrel's stall, careful not to look directly at him. She opened her worn book, stories about wild horses running free, but she barely read. She let the quiet settle, her presence soft and unthreatening. At first, Kestrel paid her no mind. His flanks shivered, he eyed the door, the window, every movement. But as the minutes ticked by, the tension in his body eased just a little. He watched her, ears flicking. Elspeth sensed this, the moment his fear dipped, curiosity surfacing in its place. She said nothing, just turned another page. Lady Beatrice noticed. She stood in the office, hands wrapped around a mug, watching the scene through the window. "She's not afraid," Beatrice murmured, almost to herself. Davies, overhearing as he entered, snorted. "She doesn't understand the risk. That horse is a powder keg. This isn't some storybook. It's a working stable, and I won't have sentiment getting someone hurt." Beatrice considered him. "She isn't sentimental. She's patient." "There's a difference." Davies's reply was crisp. "Patience is fine with ponies and lambs. With Kestrel, it's dangerous. He needs to know who's boss. Firm boundaries. We use what works, not wishful thinking." Beatrice looked down at her ledger, voice quiet. "What if what works hasn't been working? He's only gotten worse with every new handler." Davies's eyes hardened. Icarus needed boundaries too. That's how you keep them, and everyone else, safe. Beatrice almost said something more, but stopped herself, lips pressed thin. Davies's views were shaped by loss, but the trust was dying under the weight of old wounds. Out in the yard, a delivery truck rattled in. 2 horses in a nearby paddock spooked, bolting down the fence line. The commotion sent a ripple of panic through the barn. Kestrel reared in his stall, thrashing at the door, sweat breaking out along his neck. Davies rushed over, voice sharp. "Stand back, don't coddle him." He flung open the top half of the stall, meeting Kestrel's rolling eye. "Enough of that." He rattled a lunge whip at the ground, commanding, "Back!" Kestrel froze, head high, every muscle rigid. Elspeth stayed put, not moving, not speaking. When Davies tried to step in, Kestrel bared his teeth, stamping. Davies glared at Elspeth. "See? No respect. You let a horse like this push you around, you'll end up in hospital." Elspeth stared at the ground, breathing slow. She waited for Davies to leave, then carefully set her book down and inched a little closer to the stall. Not enough to intrude, but close enough for Kestrel to see she hadn't run away. Slowly, the stallion's breathing calmed. Elspeth didn't try to reach him. She simply shared space, matching his breaths, letting her own tension slip away. The next few days unfolded in a quiet standoff between 2 philosophies. Davies continued with his regimen. Strict feeding times, strong commands, no tolerance for bad behavior. Elspeth, on the other hand, visited Kestrel each morning and evening, always keeping her distance, never making demands. She let him watch her, allowed silence to stretch, offered tiny kindnesses, a fresh apple placed within sight, soft words spoken as she left for the night. Others noticed. "Strangest thing, that new girl just sits there, and he's calmer with her around," a groom said in the tack room. Davies rolled his eyes. "It's coincidence. Horses test boundaries. Give them an inch." But Lady Beatrice started watching too. One afternoon she joined Elspeth, perching on an overturned bucket. For a long while, they both just sat, the only sounds the soft snuffle of Kestrel's breath and the distant call of crows. At last, Beatrice broke the silence. "You're not like the others, are you?" Elspeth's answer was a small shake of the head. "Why do you do it? Sit so quietly?" Elspeth struggled for words, then said softly, "Sometimes you have to let them come to you. If you push too hard, they run." Beatrice studied her. "It's not what Mr. Davies believes." Elspeth glanced at her, unsure if she should go on. Finally, she whispered, "Maybe he's scared too." For a moment, Beatrice saw not just a quiet volunteer, but a girl with her own wounds, one who understood that some scars were deeper than they looked. As days passed, the tension in the barn became a subtle tug of war. Davies watched Elspeth's approach with growing irritation. To him, discipline was a lifeline, a way to keep chaos at bay. Elspeth's gentleness felt to him like surrender. One evening, as dusk fell, a storm rolled in from the hills. Lightning forked the sky, and thunder rattled the roof. Horses shuffled in their stalls, nervous and restless. Elspeth sat in the dim light, knees tucked to her chest, listening to the rain. She sensed the storm's effect on Kestrel. He paced and pawed, but his panic was softer, less frantic, as if the presence of someone steady nearby anchored him. Suddenly, a crash of thunder sent Kestrel lunging at the stall door. Elspeth's heart leaped, but she stayed very still, breathing with him. She whispered, "It's okay. I'm here." The outburst faded faster than before. Kestrel, sides heaving, stared at her through the bars. He didn't bolt, didn't kick. For the first time, he seemed to realize she was not there to hurt him. In the quiet after the storm, Lady Beatrice and Davies stood outside, watching the barn glow gold in the lamplight. Beatrice said, "Maybe we need both, strength and patience." Davies only shook his head, but as he watched Kestrel settle with Elspeth nearby, doubt crept in around the edges of his certainty. Inside, the girl and the warhorse sat together, 2 worlds apart, yet, for a moment, sharing the same fragile hope that perhaps broken things could find their way back, not through force, but through the slow work of trust. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Kestrel arrived, and the rhythm of the trust seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, around him. Rain fell nearly every day, the sky refusing to clear, as if mirroring the storm inside the old cavalry horse's mind. In the barn, routine persisted, but the stall at the far end remained an axis of tension. Everyone watched from a distance, waiting for the next explosion. But Elspeth was different. She came every morning and every evening, sitting in her usual spot a few feet away from Kestrel's stall, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the dust motes swirl in the muted light. She never brought a halter or treats. She never called to him. Instead, she brought a strange kind of quiet, a silence that was neither cold nor empty, but filled with patient intention. At first, Kestrel kept his distance. He'd stand at the back of the stall, muscles rigid, nostrils quivering, every movement wary. Sometimes he'd paw at the straw or slam his body against the wall, as if to say, "Stay away." Elspeth never flinched. She simply let the moments stretch, breathing slowly, reading aloud to herself in a soft, even voice, the words more for herself than for him. The wild horses ran across the open moor, their hooves barely touching the ground, free and unafraid. Days passed like this, a strange stalemate. Elspeth sat quietly. Kestrel eyed her with suspicion. The staff took bets on how long it would last. "She'll get bored," Davies muttered one afternoon, watching Elspeth from the tackroom doorway. "Horses need a leader, not a babysitter." But something subtle began to shift. Kestrel's outbursts, though still fierce, became less frequent. When Elspeth sat near his stall, he'd stand still a little longer, ears pricked, head lowered. His eyes tracked her movements, not with the wild panic of before, but with a dawning, cautious curiosity. One morning, as fog pooled in the valley and the barn was silent except for the rhythmic drip of rain from the gutters, Elspeth brought her book and found her spot by the stall. Kestrel was watching. Instead of turning away, she settled cross-legged and began to read, her voice just above a whisper. The wind carried the promise of something new. The wild horses waited, tense but hopeful. She could feel the horse's gaze. Every muscle in her body ached to move, to look up, to do something. Instead, she focused on her breathing, matching the slow rise and fall of her chest to the sound of Kestrel's restless shifting. The world narrowed to that small patch of straw between them, a fragile bridge built of stillness. Suddenly, a sharp noise echoed down the barn. a spade clattering to the floor. Kestrel jumped, nostrils flared, muscles bunching for flight. Elspeth didn't react, didn't even glance at the commotion. She kept reading, voice unwavering. Slowly, Kestrel's trembling subsided. He watched her, sides heaving, as if trying to puzzle out this strange creature who did not demand, who did not punish. That day marked a turning point. The next morning, Elspeth found Kestrel closer to the front of his stall, watching as she approached. She paused, uncertain, then sat as always. Kestrel took a tentative step forward, his ears flicked, eyes bright, not hostile. Elspeth opened her book, heart hammering in her chest, and began to read. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, just as she reached the end of a paragraph, she felt a warm, damp breath on her hand. She froze, afraid to look up, barely daring to breathe. Kestrel had come close, his head hanging over the stall door, nostrils twitching. He leaned in, snuffling curiously at the book. Time seemed to stop. Elspeth stayed perfectly still. Kestrel nuzzled the edge of the page, then lifted his head, blinking in the morning light. For the first time, his eyes held something softer, a question instead of a warning. From the other end of the barn, Lady Beatrice watched the scene, hand pressed to her mouth in silent awe. Even Mr. Davies, passing by with a wheelbarrow, paused. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "The brute trusts her." Elspeth let out a slow breath, her hands shaking. She set the book down on the straw just inside the stall door and whispered, "That's yours now, if you want it." Kestrel studied the object, then reached down and nudged it with his nose, sending a flutter of pages into the air. Elspeth smiled, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. From that moment, a fragile alliance was born. Each day, Kestrel came a little closer. Each day, Elspeth waited, patient and unhurried. She began to experiment, holding out her palm, open and flat, letting him sniff. Sometimes he'd accept, sometimes he'd back away, but never with the violent panic of before. The staff began to notice. "He's calmer with her around," one of the junior grooms said over lunch. "Maybe that's what he needs, someone who doesn't ask for anything." Davies remained unconvinced. "It's a fluke. Horses like him don't just forget. Sooner or later, he'll snap." But Lady Beatrice started to believe. She watched Elspeth and Kestrel with a quiet hope she'd not allowed herself in years. One afternoon, she joined Elspeth in the aisle. "What are you doing differently?" she asked. Elspeth shrugged, searching for words. "I don't know. I just try to be safe for him. I don't want anything from him he can't give." Beatrice nodded, her expression complicated. "That's rare, Elspeth. Most people want something, even if they don't admit it." Elspeth smiled, a rare and fleeting thing. "Sometimes silence is all I have." Kestrel watched them, ears flicking, eyes bright. For the first time since his arrival, he didn't look like a ghost. That evening, as twilight washed the paddocks in blue and gold, Elspeth sat quietly by the open stall. Kestrel came forward, pressing his nose into her shoulder. The contact was tentative, trembling. Elspeth closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his breath, the steady thump of his heart. For a moment they were just two survivors, a broken horse and a quiet girl, sharing the fragile promise of trust. The next morning, the news spread through the trust like wildfire. Kestrel had allowed Elspeth to touch him. The staff celebrated in their own ways. A raised eyebrow here, a muttered, "Well, I'll be damned," there. Even Davies, upon hearing, paused in the act of mucking a stall, his usual scowl deepening into something like respect. For Kestrel, the world was still uncertain, still filled with shadows and sudden noise. But each day, he chose, again and again, to approach the girl with the quiet voice and steady hands. Each day, Elspeth responded with the same unwavering patience, her own scars fading a little with every gentle touch. And so, the language of silence grew between them, not built on commands or force, but on the slow, careful work of being present. In that silence, a small miracle began to unfold. The staff watched, disbelieving, as Kestrel, once a lost cause, a dangerous liability, started to remember that not every human meant pain, and that sometimes the quietest voice could be the most healing of all. Rain pelted the slate roof in erratic bursts, turning the paddocks into rivers of mud and filling the stable aisles with a chill that seemed to creep into the bones. Inside, the trust felt quieter than usual, the staff subdued, the usual easy chatter hushed to anxious whispers. But all eyes, sooner or later, drifted down to the last stall, where Kestrel stood. He'd begun to change. There was no denying it. But for some, change meant new risks. Mr. Davies watched with mounting unease. From the office window, he saw Elspeth sitting again at her usual post near Kestrel's stall, her knees drawn to her chest, a notebook in her lap. He shook his head. The girl's approach was unorthodox, unpredictable, just like the horse she'd chosen. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders, the trust's safety, its fragile finances, the ghosts of old disasters. One evening, as darkness descended and the last grooms trudged home, Davies lingered in the stable. Kestrel stood quietly, eyes half-lidded, more relaxed than Davies had ever seen him. Yet Davies's jaw tightened. In his mind, the world was never truly safe. Tragedy came swift, and usually without warning. He made his nightly rounds with the thoroughness of a man who'd seen too much go wrong. When he passed Kestrel's stall, he hesitated, studying the horse's posture, the tension in his back, the way his ears twitched at every distant sound. Elspeth wasn't there. She'd left earlier, notebook clutched to her chest, eyes shadowed by fatigue. Alone, Davies found himself drawn to the stall, hand resting on the door as he watched the horse. Old memories surfaced, sharp as broken glass. He saw, in his mind's eye, another horse, black as night, muscles taut, eyes filled with fire. Icarus. The name still hurt to think. Years ago, before the trust belonged to Lady Beatrice, Davies had staked everything on Icarus. He'd believed fiercely that love alone could save a horse. Icarus had been special, brave, intelligent, spirited almost to a fault. But in a moment of panic, a sudden storm, a slip of the halter, a gate left ajar, tragedy had struck. Icarus had bolted, crashing through a fence, never to rise again. Davies carried the guilt like a wound that never healed. After that, he'd abandoned gentle methods. He replaced hope with caution, affection with rules, structure, discipline, boundaries. That was how you kept disaster at bay. Now, as he watched Kestrel, a horse so close to the edge, so unpredictable, Davies felt the old fear clench inside him. If something happened to Elspeth, to anyone, because of this experiment, it would be on him. He stepped away, locking the barn for the night, haunted by Icarus's memory and the silent challenge in Elspeth's eyes. That night, sleep eluded him. He replayed the accident in his mind over and over until even the ticking of his old clock sounded like hoofbeats fading into darkness. The next morning dawned brittle and cold. Davies arrived early, jaw set, determined to put an end to the risk. He found Elspeth already in the aisle, notebook open, scribbling in tight, neat handwriting. He cleared his throat. "Elspeth, I need to talk to you." She looked up, startled, eyes wary. "Yes, Mr. Davies." He tried to soften his tone, but it came out harsh. "You can't keep doing this." Sitting with him, getting close. "He's not safe. I won't have another accident on my hands." Elspeth held his gaze, voice quiet. "I'm careful. I know the risks." Davies shook his head. "You think you do, but you don't. Horses can change in an instant." Icarus was. He cut himself off, pain flickering across his face. "I've seen what happens when people get careless." Elspeth didn't back down. "Kestrel isn't being careless. Neither am I." Davies's voice rose. "He's a war horse, Elspeth. He's seen things that broke him. You can't just sit and hope he'll get better." Elspeth's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't flinch. "What if hoping is part of healing?" Davies stared at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, the quiet fire in her eyes. For a moment he saw Icarus's last rider, a girl who'd believed in miracles. He turned away, frustrated. Just stay away, Elspeth. That's an order. I'll handle Kestrel from here. He walked off, boots echoing on the concrete, leaving Elspeth alone in the quiet barn. Lady Beatrice found her there a little while later, hunched over her notebook, face pale and drawn. Did Davy speak to you? Elspeth nodded, biting her lip. He told me to stay away. Beatrice's voice was gentle. He means well, Elspeth. He lost a horse once, a long time ago. It changed him. Elspeth looked up, pain in her eyes. Kestrel's not the only one who's scared. Beatrice sat beside her. What are you writing? Elspeth turned the notebook so Beatrice could see. Pages and pages of notes. Times of day, noises, smells, everything that seemed to affect Kestrel's mood. He reacts to loud sounds, sudden movements, certain colors. The navy blue blanket scares him. I think it reminds him of the uniforms. Whenever someone slams the tack room door, he panics. When it's quiet and calm, he settles. He trusts slow hands, soft voices. Beatrice studied the pages, impressed by the detail. You're making a study of him. Elspeth nodded. If I can figure out what scares him, maybe I can help. Beatrice smiled. That's more than some professionals do, but Davies won't change his mind easily. Elspeth's expression hardened, determination rising. I don't need him to change his mind. I just need to understand Kestrel. From that point on, Elspeth became even more meticulous. She watched from afar, charting every trigger, every flash of fear or calm. When Kestrel panicked, she noted the time, the weather, what was happening nearby. She watched how he reacted to men versus women, tall people versus short, the different pitches of voices. Over time, patterns emerged. Kestrel's worst episodes followed the shriek of jet engines from the nearby airfield, or when the smell of diesel drifted in from delivery trucks. Military boots, especially those with a high shine, sent him into a cold sweat of terror. Even certain commands, stand or back, made him tremble, as if expecting pain. Elspeth shared her findings with Lady Beatrice, who listened carefully. You're saying he has PTSD, just like a person? Elspeth nodded. He's not stubborn, he's scared. And when he feels trapped, he fights back. Beatrice considered this, her mind racing. If we can prove it, maybe we can help him. Maybe we can convince Davies and the board. Elspeth looked hopeful. We have to try. But Mr. Davies wasn't swayed. When he saw Elspeth taking notes or sitting quietly nearby, he ordered her away, barking at her to find something else to do. Elspeth obeyed on the surface, but in the evenings and early mornings, when Davies was gone, she crept back to the barn, determined to keep learning. One night, she sat alone in the straw, listening to the soft sounds of Kestrel breathing. The barn was still, shadows lengthening. Elspeth pulled out her notebook and whispered, You're safe, Kestrel. I'll find a way. Kestrel stepped forward, his muzzle brushing the pages, eyes gentle. In that silent exchange, Elspeth felt a surge of hope. She was not alone in this fight. For both horse and girl, the journey was just beginning. Their scars ran deep, their fears still close to the surface. But together, they faced the darkness, searching for understanding, step by patient step. The next morning broke cold and silver, mist lying heavy over the Ainsworth Trust. Elspeth stood at the edge of the paddock, hands buried deep in her jacket pockets, notebook clutched beneath one arm. Her mind buzzed with all she'd observed. Every trigger, every flicker of trust, every retreat and small advance between herself and Kestrel. She barely slept the night before, replaying moments and patterns, hunting for meaning in the chaos of his fear. Today, she knew it was time to act. She waited until Lady Beatrice had finished her calls, then knocked softly on the office door. The room was crowded with paperwork, the edges of the window fogged by the breath of old radiators. Beatrice glanced up, her expression tired but not unkind. "Come in, Elspeth," she said, gesturing to the chair. "What brings you here so early?" Elspeth hesitated, then slid the battered notebook across the desk. I have something for you. It's about Kestrel. Beatrice's eyes sharpened. She opened the notebook, thumbing through the pages. Timelines, diagrams, columns of observations. You've been very thorough, she murmured, voice shifting from polite interest to genuine engagement. Elspeth nodded, her fingers picking at the hem of her sleeve. I wanted to understand him. I started writing down everything. Times he was scared, what was happening around him, what seemed to help. She paused, heart hammering. It's not just bad behavior. He's not defiant or mean. He's a patient, like people with PTSD. Loud sounds, uniforms, even some words. They all remind him of what happened. Beatrice read quietly for several minutes, flipping through the densely annotated pages. There were specific notes about the sound of jets from the nearby airfield, the clatter of metal, the snap of a whip, and even the color of navy blankets. Elspeth had even included charts, linking Kestrel's outbursts to identifiable triggers. She looked up, surprised. This is remarkable, Elspeth? Did you study animal behavior? Elspeth shook her head. No, I just noticed. I know what it's like to be afraid all the time, to not trust what's coming next. I think he's trying to tell us, but nobody's listening. For a long moment, Lady Beatrice sat in silence, reading and rereading the report. What do you think we should do? She finally asked, her tone more earnest than ever before. He needs therapy, Elspeth answered softly. Not punishment. The more we push him, the worse he gets. If we can change the environment, reduce the triggers, use softer voices, and never force him, he might get better. But he can't just be treated like a broken machine or a bad animal. He's scared. If we show him patience and predictability, he can heal. Beatrice pressed her fingers together, thinking. Mr. Davies would never agree. His whole career is built on discipline. But she hesitated, then leaned forward, voice hushed. The trust is running out of time, Elspeth. The board is pressuring me to make decisions, hard ones. We're short on money, and horses like Kestrel are expensive liabilities. Some want to cut our losses. If I'm going to fight for him, I need something strong. Elspeth's voice was almost a whisper. You can use my notes. Show them to the board. I know I'm just a volunteer, but Kestrel deserves more than an ending like that. Beatrice's expression softened, her eyes shining with gratitude. You've given him more than anyone else here. I'll take this to the next meeting. Thank you, Elspeth. Outside the office, the barn's atmosphere had shifted. People were tense, rumors swirling. Heard the trust might have to close down. One groom whispered, Lady Beatrice's family money only goes so far. And that Kestrel, he's just another drain. Mr. Davies, never one to shy from tough talk, gathered the staff for a meeting by the hayloft. I know things are hard. We're running on fumes. We all care about these animals, but we need to be realistic. Horses like Kestrel, dangerous, unpredictable. They put everyone at risk. I want you all to be careful. No one goes near him alone. I'll be handling him from now on. There was a murmur of agreement, though a few faces looked troubled, especially the younger volunteers who'd seen the small changes in Kestrel. Davies's word was law, and few dared challenge him. But in the days that followed, Lady Beatrice studied Elspeth's report every night. She made notes, read scientific articles online, and even reached out to a friend who worked in animal-assisted therapy. The idea was radical. Treat trauma, not just symptoms. It went against every tradition Davies upheld, but Beatrice saw the truth in Elspeth's careful observations. The day of the board meeting arrived. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. The board members gathered in the main house, faces drawn, voices low. Beatrice called the meeting to order, her posture regal but weary. I want to discuss the future of the trust, she began. There are calls for us to cut costs, to put down the animals we can't rehome. But before we make any decisions, I want you to look at this. She passed Elspeth's notebook around the table. Some board members looked skeptical, others intrigued. As they read, Beatrice spoke quietly but firmly about the findings: Kestrel's trauma, the identifiable triggers, the slow progress Elspeth had made. This isn't sentimentalism. This is science, trauma, and recovery. If we give up now, we're abandoning what this trust stands for. There was debate. One board member, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, challenged, "Do we really have time to gamble? The trust is weeks from insolvency." Beatrice's reply was calm. "If we can save Kestrel, we prove our methods work. We become a model for trauma recovery. And that attracts donors. It gives us a future." The room quieted as Beatrice finished. "We have a chance to be something more than a place for lost causes. We can be a place for real healing. I propose we give Elspeth's approach a trial. Let's document it. If it works, we'll have a powerful story for our next fundraiser." After a long pause, the oldest board member, a former veterinarian, nodded. "Let's try. For the trust and for Kestrel." Outside in the barn, Elspeth sat with Kestrel as the storm finally broke and sunlight streamed through the clouds. She didn't know what the board would decide, but as she watched Kestrel nuzzle the worn cover of her book, she let herself hope for the first time in weeks. That evening, Lady Beatrice found Elspeth in the stable. "They read your report," she said softly. "We're going to try it your way. You'll be part of his care plan, with oversight. But Elspeth, this is your chance. Make it count." Elspeth nodded, tears welling up. "Thank you. I won't let him down." The trust seemed to breathe easier that night, as if the very walls understood that, sometimes, a second chance is the only thing that stands between life and oblivion. But the fight was far from over. As word spread, Mr. Davies's jaw grew tighter. He watched Elspeth and Kestrel from a distance, a storm brewing in his eyes. "Hope won't save you, if you're wrong," he muttered. But even he felt a flicker of doubt as he watched the quiet girl and the broken warhorse stand together, neither asking anything from the other, except patience. Outside, rain gave way to a hesitant sun, promising the first real day of spring. And for the first time, both horse and girl sensed that the world might, just might, be willing to forgive and to heal. The spring sun, when it finally came, brought only the illusion of warmth. Inside the Ainsworth Trust, anxiety churned beneath the surface. Weeks had passed since Lady Beatrice presented Elspeth's report to the board, and now the trust itself seemed to hold its breath. Kestrel's future, and perhaps the trust's, hung on what would happen next. But while small moments of peace bloomed between Elspeth and Kestrel, the world outside was closing in. Early one morning, as Elspeth carried fresh hay down the barn aisle, she overheard two grooms whispering near the tack room door. "The sponsors are coming next week. Did you hear?" "Lady B's been on the phone every night." "Yeah. And if Kestrel messes up, that's it for him. They're saying this is the last shot. For him. And maybe for the rest of us." The words sank into Elspeth like stones. She moved quietly, watching Kestrel lift his head as she approached. He was calmer now, his eyes less wild, his breath steadying at the sound of her voice. Yet beneath the progress lay a tightrope, the understanding that one wrong move could unravel everything. Lady Beatrice called a meeting in the main office, sunlight streaming through dust-flecked windows onto the polished wood. The staff gathered, voices low, faces anxious. Even Mr. Davies stood silently at the back, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Beatrice addressed them all, her tone equal parts resolve and exhaustion. "The trust is facing its greatest test. We have a major sponsor, the Eaton Foundation. Coming for an inspection next week, their continued support is essential. Not just for us, but for every horse under our care. They want to see results, especially with Kestrel. If we can't show progress, we may lose more than just one horse." Davies cut in, his voice taut with frustration. "You're staking everything on that animal? I know you want to believe in miracles, Lady Beatrice, but—" She met his eyes, her voice unyielding. "No, Mr. Davies. I'm staking everything on the possibility of healing. on the work Elspeth has done. We can't survive doing things the old way." Davies shook his head but fell silent. The room brimmed with the tension of unspoken fears. Beatrice turned to Elspeth. "You'll lead the demonstration. The sponsor will see your methods firsthand, how you and Kestrel work together. This is our chance. But Elspeth, you must understand. If things go wrong, it will be the end for Kestrel. The board has been clear. No more extensions." Elspeth felt her heart stutter. She glanced at Davies, whose eyes flashed both with concern and with the ache of memories he refused to share. "I'll do my best," Elspeth managed, her voice barely audible. "Kestrel is ready for this. He just needs to know he's safe." Beatrice nodded, her gaze unwavering. "That's all any of us can ask. And Elspeth, you won't be alone. I'll be with you, but you must prepare. The demonstration must prove that Kestrel can handle new people, new sounds, even a little stress. If he can't, they'll shut us down." For the rest of the day, Elspeth moved through her chores as if in a dream. She found herself replaying every moment with Kestrel, every quiet victory, and every setback. She knew what he could do, what they could do together, but she also knew his triggers, the invisible minefield that could send him spiraling. After the meeting, Davies approached Elspeth in the barn. He hesitated, as if weighing his words, then finally spoke, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I know I've been hard on you," he said, "but I've seen what happens when hope isn't enough. Don't let your guard down, not even for a second. If Kestrel panics, you could be hurt. He swallowed, glancing away. "I lost Icarus because I believed too much. Don't make the same mistake." Elspeth looked up, her eyes steady. "Thank you, Mr. Davies. I promise I'm careful. I don't expect miracles, but I can't give up on him. Not when he's come this far." Davies nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. Over the next week, the trust became a place of nervous preparation. The staff scrubbed stalls, polished tack, repainted the chipped sign at the drive. Beatrice handled endless phone calls and emails, her energy stretched thin. Everyone knew what was at stake. The air itself felt charged, every movement fraught with meaning. Elspeth spent hours with Kestrel, not rehearsing tricks or forcing progress, but reinforcing their quiet rituals. She brought her book, reading aloud, her voice the same calm presence as always. Sometimes she simply sat, letting Kestrel draw near at his own pace. Sometimes she would stand just outside the stall, turning her back. A gesture she'd been building up to, a display of trust that went against every rule of handling traumatized horses. Kestrel, for his part, responded in kind. He would approach, ears pricked, breathing slow. He nuzzled the pages of Elspeth's book, or pressed his warm muzzle into her open palm. Some days were harder than others. When a jet screamed overhead or thunder rattled the windows, he would shudder and retreat. But each time, Elspeth waited, her patience drawing him back. 3 days before the sponsor's visit, Beatrice found Elspeth at dusk, sitting in the deepening gloom outside Kestrel's stall. "How's he doing?" Beatrice asked, voice hushed. Elspeth looked up, her eyes reflecting both hope and fear. "He's trying. Some days it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But he wants to trust. I can feel it." Beatrice nodded, placing a gentle hand on Elspeth's shoulder. "Whatever happens, you've done more for him than anyone thought possible." Elspeth blinked, trying not to cry. "He's done more for me, too." The day of the demonstration arrived bright and cold. The trust was transformed, flower beds trimmed, paths swept, every horse gleaming. The Eaton Foundation's car rolled up the drive just after noon, and the staff gathered outside, nerves on edge. The sponsors were led on a tour: the paddocks, the tack room, the exercise ring. Finally, they stopped at Kestrel's stall. Lady Beatrice spoke to the visitors, explaining Kestrel's background, his trauma, and the new approach pioneered by Elspeth. "We believe that healing is possible, even for the most broken souls," Beatrice said, her voice strong. Today, you'll see for yourselves what quiet trust can do. The barn fell silent as Elspeth entered Kestrel's stall, her heart hammering. She didn't force the moment. Instead, she sat with her book, reading as she always did. Kestrel watched her, tense at first, then slowly relaxed. The visitors leaned in, murmuring among themselves. Elspeth closed her book and rose. She turned her back to Kestrel, a gesture of absolute trust. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, Kestrel stepped forward, touching his nose gently to her shoulder. The entire barn seemed to exhale. One of the sponsors spoke up. "Is that safe?" Beatrice replied. "For Kestrel and Elspeth, it's the highest signal of trust. It's something we've never seen before." The demonstration continued. Elspeth showed how Kestrel could follow simple cues, accept touch, even stand quietly when the barn door slammed. He startled, but he didn't bolt. Each time he retreated, he returned, drawn back by the quiet space Elspeth offered him. When it ended, the sponsors applauded quietly, some visibly moved. The Eaton Foundation's director shook Elspeth's hand. "You've given us hope, not just for this horse, but for the power of compassion in all recovery." As the visitors left, Lady Beatrice caught Elspeth's arm. "You did it. No matter what happens now, you proved there's another way." In the fading afternoon, as Elspeth walked Kestrel to the far paddock, she felt the weight of the ultimatum lift, replaced by the tentative bloom of possibility. The trust was not out of danger, not yet, but for the first time, it had something powerful to offer, the proof that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal. One quiet day at a time. The morning of the final demonstration dawned cool and gold, with ribbons of sunlight slicing through the early mist. Birds called from the hedgerows, and a nervous energy crackled over the trust. Today would decide everything. Not just for Kestrel, but for Elspeth, for Lady Beatrice, and perhaps even for Davies, who had spent his life believing that rules mattered more than hope. By sunrise, Elspeth was already at the barn, her hands trembling as she filled the water buckets and swept the aisle. Kestrel stood at the door of his stall, watching her. He looked different now. Less the haunted warhorse, and more an animal beginning to remember what safety felt like. His coat shone, and his eyes, though still wary, were clear. Elspeth drew a deep breath. Today, she would not ask Kestrel for tricks or perfection. She would simply offer the calm, gentle rituals that had slowly bridged the gulf between them. The quiet reading, the slow approach, the space to breathe and make choices. It wasn't a show. It was a conversation, wordless and sacred. As the hour of the demonstration drew near, the trust became a stage. Staff bustled, adjusting hay nets, dusting every surface until the barn gleamed. Mr. Davies moved through the yard, barking out orders with extra urgency, but even his commands were tinged with nervousness. Lady Beatrice wore her best riding jacket, her silver hair caught in a neat braid, her eyes sharp but hopeful. The sponsors arrived in a line of polished cars, stepping out with notepads and kind but skeptical smiles. The Eaton Foundation's director, Mrs. Hamilton, paused at the paddock, watching the horses graze in the sunlight. "It's a beautiful place, Lady Beatrice," she said quietly, "but you know what we're here to see." "I do," Beatrice replied, her voice steady. "And I'm ready for you to see it." They moved to the barn. The staff gathered at the far end, watching silently. Davies stood beside the feed bins, arms crossed, but he didn't look away. For all his misgivings, he couldn't deny the pull of hope. That maybe, just maybe, they were on the brink of something new. Elspeth slipped into Kestrel's stall, closing the half door behind her. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, but she focused on her breathing, on the warm presence of the horse she'd come to trust. She opened her battered book and began to read, her voice low and steady. The wind carried the wild horses over the moor, free and unafraid. At first, Kestrel paced, muscles quivering, glancing at the unfamiliar faces gathered outside his stall. Elspeth didn't react. She just kept reading, letting the rhythm of her voice fill the quiet. After a few minutes, Kestrel slowed. He stood still, head lowered, ears flicked to Elspeth's voice. The demonstration was not dramatic. Elspeth didn't attempt any circus acts. Instead, she built a tapestry of calm, letting Kestrel choose his place in the dance. She set her book down, moved to the center of the stall, and waited. Kestrel hesitated, then took a step forward. Outside, Mrs. Hamilton leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration. Lady Beatrice whispered, "Watch their signals. It's not about control. It's about trust." Elspeth turned her back to Kestrel, the final test. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Kestrel stretched his neck and touched her shoulder with his nose. His breath, a warm exhale against her skin. Elspeth closed her eyes, her own breath trembling. Every instinct told her to stay still, to trust. A sudden noise shattered the quiet. A metal bucket knocked over in the next stall. Kestrel flinched, but instead of bolting, he looked to Elspeth. She turned, met his gaze, and offered her open hand. Kestrel stepped forward, touching her palm. The sponsors watched, breath held. Elspeth gently slid a halter over Kestrel's head. He didn't resist. She led him out into the aisle, past the rows of wide-eyed staff and skeptical visitors. The barn door creaked as she led Kestrel into the sunlight. He hesitated, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar crowd, but Elspeth spoke quietly. "It's okay. I'm here." Kestrel took another step, then another. At the far end of the paddock, Elspeth let the lead rope drop, trusting Kestrel to stay. She walked away, turning her back again, the most vulnerable posture a human could offer a horse. Kestrel stood, muscles trembling, then walked after her, coming to stand at her side. A hush fell. The sponsors, the staff, Lady Beatrice, even Davies, stood motionless. It was not a trick or a show. It was something deeper, a mutual choice to trust, to risk vulnerability in the hope of something better. Mrs. Hamilton was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like it. You're telling me this horse, who is marked as dangerous, has learned this through patience alone?" Elspeth nodded, unable to find words. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her own voice quiet but fierce. "You've seen what we do here isn't just about saving horses. It's about changing how we understand trauma, in animals and in people. Kestrel's not just a story. He's proof that the old ways aren't the only way." Davies cleared his throat, his gruffness softened. "There's not a horseman alive who'd recommend turning your back on an animal like that. But I can't deny what I just saw." For the next hour, Elspeth and Kestrel stayed together in the paddock. She read from her book as Kestrel grazed at her feet. The sponsors asked questions, took notes, and, by the end, their skepticism had faded into genuine wonder. As the last car pulled away, Lady Beatrice hugged Elspeth. "You did it," she whispered. "No matter what comes next, you did it." Davies approached, awkward, hands stuffed into his pockets. He didn't quite meet Elspeth's eyes. "You proved me wrong. That's not easy to do." Elspeth smiled, shy but radiant. "It's not about being right or wrong. It's about listening." Davies nodded. "Maybe so. Maybe we both have something to learn." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the first stars appeared, Elspeth sat with Kestrel in the fading light. The day's tension melted into a quiet joy. For the first time, she believed, truly believed, that trust could be enough. That maybe her quiet way had a place in the world after all. The barn was quiet, the paddocks golden, and above them all, a blackbird sang. A single clear note, carrying across the fields, as if to celebrate the fragile, beautiful melody that two broken souls had learned to share. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. The day after the demonstration, the trust pulsed with a sense of anticipation and relief. Elspeth walked the paddocks in the gentle light, her steps lighter than they'd been in months. Staff smiled at her in passing. Even Mr. Davies, who'd always worn skepticism like armor, offered her a brief nod of respect. Lady Beatrice met with the Eaton Foundation's director in the study, the conversation earnest and hopeful. From behind the kitchen door, Elspeth heard words like revolutionary, healing, and future partnership. It seemed as if the trust's fate might finally be turning, if only today, when as well as yesterday. The true test, though, was still to come. A follow-up assessment had been scheduled. An official from the Foundation, a veterinarian, and several other potential benefactors would observe Kestrel and Elspeth working together. This time, the trust couldn't control every variable. They'd do it outside, in the main training ring, exposed to all the unpredictability of the real world. The morning was fresh, the sky a clear blue. By noon, clouds had thickened, casting shifting shadows over the grounds. Elspeth dressed with deliberate calm, worn jeans, a soft sweater, boots that felt like an extension of herself. She brushed Kestrel slowly, speaking to him in whispers, feeling his breath slow, his muscles relax under her hands. He watched her with those intelligent eyes, searching for the steady reassurance that had always been there. Lady Beatrice appeared at the barn door. "They're ready for you, Elspeth," she said, her voice equal parts encouragement and warning. Elspeth nodded, swallowing hard. "We'll be all right. He knows I'm here." Outside, a small crowd had gathered along the fence line. Lady Beatrice, Mr. Davies, the Foundation's team, the vet, staff, and several visitors. Their faces betrayed everything: skepticism, hope, curiosity, doubt. Elspeth led Kestrel into the ring, the gelding tensed, ears flicking at every cough and shuffle. But Elspeth didn't rush. She waited, giving him time to survey the space, letting the quiet fill the air. She started as she always did, reading softly from her book, ignoring the onlookers, her focus solely on Kestrel. The horse's breathing steadied. He came to her, standing close enough that his nose brushed her arm. One of the Foundation officials asked, "Will he walk with you, freely, without a lead?" Elspeth nodded. She turned, walking away, feeling Kestrel's presence behind her like a shadow. He followed, slow but willing, each step an act of trust. When she stopped, he stopped. When she crouched and offered her palm, he nuzzled it, searching for comfort. A ripple of approval swept through the onlookers. The veterinarian took notes, the officials whispered to each other. Lady Beatrice caught Elspeth's eye, her face bright with pride. But then, in the next moment, the sky split open. A deep, guttural roar swept overhead. Everyone looked up. A Royal Air Force fighter jet, screaming low above the treetops, its engines thunderous, leaving a shuddering echo in its wake. Kestrel's body snapped rigid. His eyes rolled white, nostrils flared, ears flat. The old panic, the war, the chaos, the memory of that awful day rushed back like a flood. He spun, hooves gouging furrows in the dirt, breath coming in ragged gasps. People shouted. Someone fumbled with a gate latch. Mr. Davies started forward, panic in his voice. "Back! Give him space! Don't crowd!" The world seemed to dissolve into chaos. Elspeth didn't move. Her mind was oddly clear. She remembered every moment spent in the stall, every inch of trust they'd built, every time she'd chosen patience over fear. She dropped her book, took a step back, and then, with every muscle screaming at her to run, she did the one thing no trainer would ever recommend. She turned her back on Kestrel, arms loose at her sides, standing utterly still in the middle of the ring. A hush fell. People stared, wide-eyed, waiting for disaster. Lady Beatrice's hands covered her mouth. Mr. Davies froze, torn between intervention and belief. Kestrel's hooves pounded the earth, circling. His body shook, sides flecked with sweat, eyes wild. He tossed his head, searching for escape, for an enemy, for something to fight. The crowd's fear pulsed in the air, thick and contagious. But Elspeth didn't move. She breathed, steady and slow, and in the language only the two of them shared, she said, "I am not afraid of you. I trust you. I'm still here." For long moments, nothing happened. The only sounds were the wind, the distant jet, and Kestrel's ragged breaths. Then, something in the warhorse's eyes changed. His head dropped. Ears flicked forward. He slowed, circling once, twice, and then, impossibly, he stepped towards Elspeth. People gasped, bracing for disaster. But Kestrel came up behind her, close enough that his breath moved her hair. Elspeth closed her eyes, willing herself to trust. Kestrel touched his nose to her shoulder. A choice, not a reaction. His trembling eased. The world, for one fragile moment, grew still. Elspeth finally turned, tears streaking her face, and pressed her forehead to his. She whispered, "You're safe now? It's over." Mr. Davies let out a slow, shuddering breath. Lady Beatrice blinked, dazed as the tension dissolved into relief and awe. The crowd, silent a beat longer, burst into applause, not loud but reverent, as if they'd witnessed something sacred. The vet murmured, "I've never seen a recovery like this. Not in all my years." The Foundation's director stepped forward, her eyes shining. "That was extraordinary. It's not just the horse you saved, Miss Elspeth. It's the idea that healing is possible, even when everyone else has given up." Lady Beatrice moved to Elspeth's side, her hand trembling as she placed it on the girl's shoulder. "You did it. You and Kestrel. You changed everything." Mr. Davies lingered at the fence, watching the pair. He remembered Icarus, the pain of loss, the walls he'd built around himself. And for the first time, those walls felt less necessary. The sponsors spoke in urgent whispers, promises of grants and partnerships floating on the air. But for Elspeth and Kestrel, the rest of the world faded away. In the quiet ring, among the dust and the soft sound of horses in the paddocks, they simply stood together, two survivors choosing, over and over, to trust. That night, as the sun set and the barn fell quiet, Lady Beatrice called a staff meeting. She shared the news. The Eaton Foundation's funding was secured. The trust would not only survive, but would be able to launch a new program, one dedicated to trauma recovery, for horses and humans alike. And Elspeth, the silent volunteer, would be asked to lead it. As the staff cheered, Elspeth glanced at Kestrel, who stood nearby, calm and radiant in the twilight. She thought of every battle fought, every scar, and every act of courage, and knew that none of it had been in vain. Above the trust, the sky was finally clearing. The thunder had passed, and in its place was something brighter, stronger, the quiet music of hope, carrying forward on the evening breeze. The barn doors stood open at sunrise, letting in a spill of gold and blue. For the first time in months, the air inside the Ainsworth Trust felt light, even giddy, as if the earth itself had let go of something heavy. Every surface seemed to glow, buckets polished, hay sweet and fresh, the tack room shining. Even the horses in their paddocks moved with unusual calm, as though they sensed a turning of the tide. Word of the extraordinary scene in the training ring traveled fast. In town, people who had never set foot on Trust land whispered about the miracle horse and the girl with the silent hands. Local papers called it a breakthrough. Donors began sending letters and small checks, each one carrying hope. Yet for those who had lived through the long winter, none of it felt quite real. Elspeth barely slept the night after the demonstration. She wandered the paddocks beneath the cold stars, Kestrel at her side, her mind awash with images she couldn't quite believe. The roar of the jet, the swirling panic, her own wild choice to stand still when every instinct screamed to run. And then, impossibly, the moment when Kestrel had chosen trust over fear. When dawn came, Elspeth was still awake. She stood at the fence, fingers tangled in the rough wood, watching the morning light spill across the fields. Kestrel stood beside her, grazing, then looked up and nudged her shoulder, as if to say, "We're still here." In the main house, Lady Beatrice was already at her desk, sifting through emails and messages. The Eaton Foundation's director had written before dawn, "We are deeply moved and fully committed to the partnership. Let's make the Ainsworth Trust a beacon for trauma recovery, for animals and people alike." Attached was a promise of immediate funding, enough to not only secure the trust, but to begin planning a whole new program. Beatrice exhaled, the kind of breath that only comes after months of holding fear inside. She found herself blinking back tears. She sent word to the staff, calling a meeting for mid-morning. The excitement was contagious. People hurried through chores, laughter, and relief echoing in the aisles. Even Mr. Davies seemed changed. Where he once barked orders, he now spoke in a gruff but almost gentle tone, asking after Kestrel, nodding at Elspeth in the yard. He was quieter, more watchful, as if he too was trying to understand how everything he'd believed could shift overnight. When the staff gathered, Lady Beatrice stood in the center of the old office, sunlight making a halo of her silver hair. "I want to thank you all," she began. "What we saw yesterday wasn't just a victory for Kestrel. It was a victory for compassion, for patience, for the idea that healing is possible. The Eaton Foundation is giving us the chance to launch a new program, trauma recovery for animals and for the humans who care for them. And I'm proud to announce that Elspeth will be leading this new chapter." A round of applause rose. Not the polite sort, but something fierce and joyful. Elspeth ducked her head, overwhelmed by the attention, but Lady Beatrice placed a reassuring hand on her back. "This is your moment, Elspeth. You've earned it." The next days were a whirlwind. The Foundation sent consultants to tour the facilities, asking endless questions about Kestrel, about the methods Elspeth had developed almost by instinct. The board voted to expand the Trust's mission. Davies found himself meeting with therapists and animal behaviorists, quietly absorbing ideas that once would have seemed laughable. The local news filmed a segment on the war horse who learned to trust, and soon the Trust's inbox was flooded with inquiries from families with troubled horses, and even from veterans struggling with their own wounds. Amid all the bustle, Elspeth and Kestrel continued their rituals. No matter how many eyes watched, she stayed faithful to what worked: quiet presence, soft words, patient waiting. Their trust, now witnessed by so many, remained private and sacred. One afternoon, as the consultants were touring, a young woman arrived at the Trust's gates, clutching the lead rope of a trembling pony. "He hasn't let anyone touch him in weeks," she said, her voice thick with worry. "My last hope was here. I saw the news." Elspeth smiled, nervous but determined. She crouched, letting the pony sniff her hand, waiting in silence. It took almost an hour, but by the end the pony leaned into her touch, shivering but curious. The owner wept with relief. "How did you do it?" "I just listened," Elspeth said quietly. "I let him decide." Word spread quickly. Soon there was a waiting list of animals and people who needed a different kind of help. The Trust felt alive in a new way, as a sanctuary not just for horses, but for anyone who carried invisible scars. Lady Beatrice watched Elspeth with a mixture of pride and wonder. "You've given us more than a method," she told her one evening, standing in the golden light of the paddocks. "You've given us a story, and that will help more than you know." Even Mr. Davies began to thaw. He asked Elspeth to show him her notes, standing awkwardly at her shoulder as she explained her observations. "I was wrong about you, and about Kestrel," he admitted, voice rough. "I thought, if you weren't hard, you'd break. But you're the strongest one here." Elspeth shook her head. "It's not strength, Mr. Davies. It's just not giving up, even when it's hard." He nodded, eyes shining with something unspoken. "Icarus would have liked you. Maybe he would have had a chance, if I'd known what you know now." Elspeth placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Maybe. Or maybe he gave you something you could pass on. We all carry something forward, even when it hurts." As the week drew to a close, the Trust held a celebration, a simple gathering of staff, board members, and new friends. There were homemade pies, music played on an old radio, laughter echoing under the dusk sky. Kestrel, newly named the ambassador horse of the new program, wore a garland of wildflowers and stood calmly while visitors stroked his neck and snapped pictures. Elspeth stood with Lady Beatrice and Mr. Davies at the edge of the paddock, watching Kestrel move among the guests. "I never thought I'd see the day," Davies admitted. "I thought he was lost." "He was," Beatrice replied. "But sometimes the lost find their way home, if someone is willing to wait with them." Elspeth looked up at the stars flickering above the fields. For the first time, she felt something like belonging, not just at the trust, but in the world. And when Kestrel wandered over and laid his great head on her shoulder, Elspeth closed her eyes, letting gratitude and hope wash over her. Together, they had survived the storm. Together, they would help others find the dawn. It was nearly summer by the time the Ainsworth Trust transformation was complete. Warm breezes stirred the wildflowers along the fence lines, and sunlight spilled over the freshly painted barn roofs. Even the air seemed different, lighter, expectant, as if the land itself could sense the change. The trust was no longer just a refuge for unwanted horses. It had become a place where healing was as real as the morning dew. The new program had taken root quickly. Every stall was filled, not just with horses, but with stories. There was Jasper, the ex-racehorse who flinched at sudden noises; Molly, the pony who had once lived alone in a muddy field; a donkey called Bruno who refused to enter any barn unless Elspeth was there to walk beside him. And for each animal, there was a human shadow: veterans with haunted eyes, children who spoke in whispers, mothers who carried burdens too heavy to name. At the center of it all stood Kestrel, the ambassador, the survivor, the horse who had taught everyone that silence could be another kind of music. On the day of the first open house for the new program, the trust was alive with nervous excitement. Volunteers decorated the main barn with garlands of ivy and wildflowers. There were tables set up under the old oak, where Lady Beatrice greeted visitors with the warmth of someone whose heart had been reopened. Mr. Davies, surprisingly spry for a man who'd spent decades on his feet, showed newcomers how to groom and lead a horse with steady hands. Children darted through the paddocks, their laughter trailing behind them. Elspeth woke before dawn, too restless to sleep. She found Kestrel already awake, head raised, watching the light spill over the horizon. She pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes. "Ready, old friend?" Kestrel nickered softly, his breath warm on her cheek. The open house began slowly, with a handful of families and local press. But as the morning passed, more visitors arrived. Old donors, new neighbors, people who'd heard the story of the warhorse and the quiet girl who saved him. The atmosphere was celebratory, but also reverent. People spoke in low tones, careful not to startle the animals. There was music, a student string quartet from the village, their notes floating across the paddocks like birds. Lady Beatrice led a tour, pausing in front of Kestrel's paddock. "This is Kestrel, our ambassador," she said, her voice ringing with pride. "His journey taught us all that healing doesn't come from force or fear, but from trust, patience, and the courage to begin again. He is living proof that no creature, animal or human, is ever truly lost." Children clustered by the fence. One small boy, his arm in a sling, reached out. Kestrel came to the fence, lowering his massive head, and the boy stroked his nose with gentle awe. Elspeth spent much of the day moving quietly among the guests, answering questions, demonstrating the gentle routines that had become the trust's new foundation. She led workshops with the other staff: how to recognize signs of fear in a horse, how to offer comfort without pressure, how to listen, not with words, but with presence. She was still herself, reserved, soft-spoken, most comfortable at the edges. But now, people listened when she spoke. Her silence was no longer mistaken for shyness, but honored as another form of wisdom. In the afternoon, Lady Beatrice called everyone together. Under the shade of the great oak, she stood beside Elspeth and Mr. Davies, her eyes shining with emotion. "Today, we begin a new chapter," Beatrice said, her voice trembling. "A chapter not just for the trust, but for all those who carry scars that cannot be seen. None of this would have been possible without Elspeth's quiet determination and Kestrel's willingness to trust again. Their story will guide us as we help others find their own way back to hope." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Beatrice turned to Elspeth. "Would you say a few words?" Elspeth's heart pounded, but she nodded. She looked out at the gathered faces, some familiar, some new, all expectant. She found Kestrel's gaze in the crowd and let his calm steady her. "I used to think Silence was something broken, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I couldn't speak the way others did, I didn't belong. But Kestrel taught me that there are many ways to be heard. Sometimes just being with someone, not asking them to be different, not rushing them, is enough. Healing takes time. It takes patience. And sometimes it takes someone believing in you before you can believe in yourself. She glanced at Davies, who nodded, his face full of hard-earned pride. Elspeth continued, This place is for anyone who needs it. Horses, people, anyone who feels lost or scared. You're safe here. We'll listen. We'll wait with you as long as it takes. There was silence, and then a gentle, heartfelt applause. Later, as dusk began to fall, Elspeth walked with Kestrel to the far field. The sky was painted in bands of rose and lavender. She watched as he moved among the other horses, calm and assured, a leader not by force, but by quiet example. Mr. Davies joined her, leaning on the fence. Never thought I'd see the day, he said, voice low. That horse, he's teaching us all something. Elspeth smiled. We're all learning, Mr. Davies, even you. He chuckled, shaking his head. I suppose I am. They watched in silence for a while, the trust alive with new voices, new laughter, new stories. From the paddock, Lady Beatrice waved, her face lit by the last rays of sun. As the evening cooled, Elspeth lingered at the barn, tending to the animals. She caught Davies watching her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. You did good, kid, he said quietly. You both did. When the last guest had left, Lady Beatrice closed the great barn doors, standing in the golden light. She turned to Elspeth. Thank you, she said. For saving him? For saving us? Elspeth shook her head. You did that. You all did. We just listened. In the fading light, Elspeth returned to Kestrel, resting her cheek against his neck. He stood still, a living testament to what patience and belief could do. A symphony is more than a single melody. It's every note, every silence, every moment of discord and resolution. At the Ainsworth Trust, a new music had begun to play, not loud, not showy, but deep and sure, echoing across the fields into tomorrow. For the lost, the broken, the silent, there would always be a place here. And as the moon rose over the trust, Elspeth and Kestrel stood together, quietly listening to the promise of a new dawn.